My name is Dawn Ross, and I'm the Programs Manager at Art Jameel. We are very excited to open Ala Younis' exhibition tonight, called Plan for Feminist Greater Baghdad, and even more excited to have Ala with us here to discuss the exhibition in conversation with Shumon Basar. The talk this evening will go for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll move to the gallery space where Ala will give us a guided tour of the exhibition. This exhibition is a collaboration between Art Jameel and Delphina Foundation, and it's being held simultaneously both in London and Dubai. The exhibition includes a major new installation, which was also co-commissioned by Art Jameel and Delphina Foundation, titled Plan Femme for Greater Baghdad, that builds on Younis' 2015 work titled Plan for Greater Baghdad, which was included in the central exhibition of the 56th Venice Biennale, and is on loan tonight for this exhibition from the Bargil Art Foundation. I would now like to introduce both Ala and Shumon. Ala Younis is a research-based artist and curator based in Amman. Her work has been featured in numerous exhibitions around the world, including Guggenheim Museum, Venice Biennale, New Museum New York, Istanbul Biennale, Homeworks 5 Beirut, and Photo Cairo 4. As a curator, Ala Younis organized the first Kuwaiti pavilion at the 55th Venice Biennale, as well as other exhibitions and programs in Egypt, France, Jordan, and the UAE. She holds a degree in architecture from University of Jordan and a Master's of Research in Visual Cultures from Goldsmiths College. Shumon Basar, who will be in conversation with Ala tonight, is a writer, curator, and cultural critic. He is also a member of Art Jameel's curatorial council. He is co-author of The Age of Earthquakes, A Guide to the Extreme Present, with Douglas Copeland and Hans Ulrich Obrist. He is commissioner of the Global Art Forum in Dubai, editor-at-large at Tank Magazine, and contributing editor at Bedouin Magazine. Please join me in welcoming Ala and Shumon.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you to Art Jameel for inviting me to do this with my good friend Ala Younis. So, as Dawn said, as soon as we're done here, we're going to walk over all the way to there, and then Ala will give us a tour through the work. So, since that's going to be happening, and she'll be going through a lot of the details of the project, then I don't necessarily obviously want to double up too much. So we thought what we would do now is, in a sense, explore some of the backstory to what you're about to see in there. And it is an kind of extraordinary backstory, or series of backstories, and also maybe probe a little into the kind of motivations that that have brought you to where you are today. I did something last night which I realized I'd never done before, which was kind of try and read the Wikipedia page on Iraq. It's extremely confusing and obviously it's extremely long, and it gets even more confusing and more complicated the closer it gets to where we are now. But I think it's important to maybe start with a few key dates, and maybe it would be great to hear from you. Maybe if you could just sketch out a kind of essential timeline of what happens in Iraq, let's say from 58 to 1982, and you'll find out why 82 becomes an important year. So Ala, maybe you could start there.
Thank you very much, Shumon and Art Jameel and all of you. So in just before 1958, Iraq has renegotiated their revenues from the sales of the Iraqi oil, and this is how they could make so much more money, and decided to build the infrastructure of the country, but also, not just that, but also invite international architects to build, key institutions in Iraq, in Baghdad in particular. And among these people were Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, and Otto Gropius, and several others. And it was also the time when all these Iraqi architects who were trained outside in the US or in the UK were coming back also to lead projects or open their offices or be employed within these within the governmental institutions. So so among these were Le Corbusier, who was commissioned to do a sports complex. His designs got approved. He gets a telegram 2 days before a military coup or / revolution happens in 1958, which removes the monarch and installs the republic, installs Abdel Karim Qasim as prime minister of the republic. So that's the first moment that kind of interrupted this series of developments. So the first thing that happens is that they cancel the master plans and they start a new contract with or they look for like Doxiadis master plan, the Greek urban planner, and then there's a new master plan that has shifted the location and the land orientation for Le Corbusier, which had to redo all of what he did in the first place. And just as the story goes, there was another military coup that happened in '63 that removed this prime minister and installed a new president. Happened to be his deputy, and this new president passed away a couple of years after because his helicopter crashed, and his brother became the president, and then the Ba'ath Party did their own military coup that removed also this other president. So and the new president Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr took over in '68. And that was when Saddam became the rising star, perhaps as a deputy of the president, and he led like the nationalization project of the oil industry, and his images were printed on some stamps, for instance, until '78 when so Le Corbusier has passed away already in '65. He drowned. And he was swimming and got a heart stroke, and he drowned. So the project that his sports complex got faded somehow, but because of so many other reasons that we'll see inside. But so '78 they start to build the gymnasium. Saddam Hussein becomes the president in '79. They finish building the gymnasium, and it's named after him. Only the gymnasium from Le Corbusier's contract these major designs were built, and so it's only the gymnasium, and it's named after the new president, which did not visit the building upon its inauguration because of the Iran-Iraq war that has just started. And the Iran-Iraq war ends in '88, but in the '80s, there were like another wave of international architects that came to do, upon the invitation from Saddam Hussein himself, to build an even newer Baghdad with all sorts of different sorts of buildings and institutions, and all of this work from the '50s until in 1989 becomes strategic targets in the 1991 war, just after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and it stirred the world's allies to come, and the war Baghdad was struck by missiles, and all these buildings, or many of these buildings, were bombed. And then probably the story continues as Baghdad lived under this blockade for many years until 2003, when the fall of Baghdad, and the American troops takes over, and they station some of their troops inside the gymnasium and the stadium that's built next to it, that was not part of Le Corbusier's work. For 3 years, and this is when there were attempts to see, people who wanted to see the gymnasium could not go in, for instance, like new scholars or people who have started to visit Iraq as part of this liberated space somehow, until the American troops left, and around 2006, and then we arrive at this. That's where the story goes more towards the heritage, looking at this building more of a heritage site and so on.
So maybe it would be worth exploring a little bit why, why a building by Le Corbusier in Baghdad matters at all. I just want to check, because we shouldn't make any assumption, who doesn't know who Le Corbusier is or hasn't heard of him, just in case. You're obviously a very well-informed audience. But clearly, I mean, by the mid-50s, arguably Le Corbusier is probably the most famous architect actually in the world. I mean, I was going to qualify that and say something like the Western world, but one of the things that makes him so important is he becomes one of the first globe-trotting, globalized architects, right? So, and he does something which is commonplace now, which is he gets on planes and he goes to faraway places, and often during that period, it's obviously the beginning of a period of like decolonization. And he's already been the master plan at Chandigarh, which is a new capital, the Punjab capital in northern India. And then already at that point, his protégés, Costa and so on and so forth, are redesigning. Niemeyer, of course, in Brasilia, are manifesting the international style at these huge scales, right? So it clearly mattered to Iraq in the mid-50s that it was going to be part of this broader narrative, particularly a narrative that's, as you say, sees architects like Walter Gropius, etc. I mean, there's an unrealized Niemeyer project in Abu Dhabi, so on and so forth. So, could you say something about, how and why Le Corbusier and those kind of group of architects, and why it was important, and what sort of cultural milieu was that kind of coming out of, even though it's so short-lived?
So there were Iraqi architects who went to study abroad, and because there were no necessarily like the architectural studies in the sense that we know of today, that were in Baghdad, the type of building that was taking place is also very much cherished by these same architects. So they speak a lot about these builders. That was more like a handcraft. The people who were very skilled and knew how to build all these like heritage buildings that we consider as heritage buildings now. But they sought their education in abroad, as I said, and perhaps like some of them were students of Walter Gropius. And when they returned to Baghdad, there was not yet a republic. It was still being liberating itself from the colonial time, anyways, from the British mandate and so on. But they were still under, of course, like there were so many British companies and experts and all sorts of things doing things for Iraq at the time. So even when they wanted to, if they wanted to do work on things themselves, I think first of all, they kind of wanted to extend the world that they studied into the world they lived in. They had and they had the means to do so because they had money. These architects were interested in new areas and new countries that were, putting together new plans and new infrastructures, building from. Not really from scratch, but kind of like there were areas that were kind of really built all new again. Why does it matter? I mean, I asked this question to Rifat Jadirji himself, one of the star architects of Iraq, and I said, what do you think of all these like timelines of buildings and architects and international architects and all these governments that never lived long enough to see the results of their commissions? And he was like, I don't think it matters. I think these buildings were just examples of modern architecture that we wanted to have like samples of in our country for people to experience firsthand. What would a building by Walter Gropius look like, or Le Corbusier? But have they done anything necessarily to our, to what like our, to us? I don't think they did a lot. So I think it was more of, there were all these, I think the second part of the project which like both projects happened because I studied architecture, and I studied architecture in the aftermath of the Gulf War. So it was when the time that Baghdad being destructed, when we were thinking and studying how to build not just houses but also cities, and we it was so this plan Forget About That, which is the title, from the title of Frank Lloyd Wright's proposal, kind of sounded to me like okay, this unfulfilled promise. You learn or you attempt to do all of this, and you spend all this effort, and eventually there's a place that you can't access or cannot be, like whatever that you've done is not there anymore, or cannot really function the way you have planned it to be. So it's like basically a failed promise somehow, or a delayed promise. But that brought all these elements together. We were studying Le Corbusier in the first year, and Frank Lloyd Wright. That's like the ABC of everything. And of course, it would have meant a lot to know that there was a building by him in Baghdad, but we didn't. But this is why also part of the project is to locate where it appeared as a building in all the Iraqi publications, for instance, because there could have been this access to this piece of information, but apparently was not that important to the region necessarily, to the point that it was not taught in our schools.
But I guess one of the things that we glean through your research is the fact that there's a slowness to architecture that makes it vulnerable to all kinds of ambient political forces. You probably know the Oscar Niemeyer project in Tripoli, in Lebanon, which is another great, one of these kind of almost like, instant mythologies, but is a project that when you kind of list the great Niemeyer projects, you don't necessarily talk about that one, and that. It's a convention center that was commissioned in the early 70s. Niemeyer, unlike Le Corbusier, he hated flying. So he was like one of the first remote control architects, and he would literally send his drawings over and probably a representative, and then they would get built. So Niemeyer never went to Lebanon, but this project began, and then of course the Civil War starts in 75 and literally freezes and becomes an instant ruin, and it's still there as an instant ruin. But again, it's now in retrospect, they become these incredible repositories of like forensic, both material evidence, but also narrative evidence. It's a A.L. Weizmann would say something like, what would happen if you ask a building to speak, right? Or you ask particularly a site of destruction, right, to speak, And at what point do you? Because what you're doing here, it seems to me, is historic. It's a historical project, but somehow at the center, particularly of the first part, is a building, and it through that building we're able to, it seems to me, to understand all these these political convulsions. Is that simply because you trained as an architect that you feel sensitive to that, or do you think it's something else?
I think it's the history. Of course, my training informed a little bit my interest. My interest also, like in. Okay, it must be the politics. It was very obvious that the politics has changed or affected the fate of this building for so many years. But it was also this building as a material evidence. That was very important, because for many years it stayed as a concept, as a drawing, and only like 25 years after it was commissioned that it was built. But also when it was built, it was the point where, okay, fine, we finally built this project that we took us all this time to, organize and whatever, and now we move ahead and we have like much bigger, things to build and much more glamorous and high-rise buildings and all sorts of things, but there were also other very important things to take care of, like wars, all these wars, all the monuments that have to come with the wars. So it was. I think it is a mix of architecture. I mean, it is an. Okay, so probably it was driven by politics most of the time, while at the same time there were all these Iraqi lives that were trying to do their work. You know, they're trying to be architects in the cities that they belong to and to work on architecture that they like, but they have to work within the system, you know, because the system functions like this and so on. So there was a lot of implication, that not necessarily, I mean, much of it was probably by choice, but as much was not really by choice. And then there was also this very interesting intellectual life where they were discussing heritage, new styles, new modes of production, collaborations. What sort of architecture did they develop based on this modernity, but also on the heritage that they have? And this kind of developed these styles that kind of also rippled throughout the region, particularly in the Gulf and in Jordan. So there was something that was, and there were, like, in the stories that you read in the books, there were sometimes Saddam Hussein himself summoned architects to his office to sketch for them the type of arches he likes, you know, to be built in the buildings that he was commissioning. So there was a lot of. So one of the characters, also like the second president of the Republic, was folding the sleeve of his military suit as he was telling Rifat Jadirji, "Let's plan." As if his work is basically to participate in the planning of villages, and he was killed on his way back from one of these planning trips. So there was a lot of mix between the two. There was a lot of the architectural and the urban planning of Baghdad was very much a work of politics as much as it was of the architects. And what it was missing, I think, what I was also very much interested in is not just how the major politics were changing, but also who were these workers, who were these facilitators in the middle, who were caught in these processes, whether they liked it or not. But and what type of work they did, lives they led, you know, in light of all of these things that were happening.
And then bringing us up to the present moment and the new work that you're going to show us now. The first part dealt with this famous building, a famous architect, and its various sort of difficult, like a prolonged difficult birth. But then you say all the protagonists that you highlighted during that part of the project were all men. Mm-hmm. And so obviously now in this part, it's an enumeration of significant female protagonists. Was that always the plan? Or was that a kind of reaction to your own inadvertent patriarchal narrative that you'd excavated?
So I was aware as I was selecting these men that they were all men, and I was like, okay, but then
men are sneaky.
And then I was like, what's that scandal? People are gonna come and say not a single woman in this project, but no one said anything really, and it was surprising. But I was also
they were all men, probably.
But I was like, yeah, great. But then I was thinking, I didn't want to have like a woman quota situation where like out of 7 men there's 1 woman, or 2 women, 7 men, whatever. So I was thinking also that these men were the people who appear in the grand narrative when I want to say it was built or not, delayed or not, master plan cancelled or not. They were all decisions made necessarily like on the grand level by men, but there were also the memoirs and the books and the interviews and all of these things that were recorded or that I had access to were by men. But there was also the word plan, because you said when you planned your project. Yes, as I was trying to translate the work plan, the title of the work, Plan for Greater Baghdad, there were these 2 possibilities. It's either I use the word mukhattat, which means a scheme or an urban, something that means like a drawing or a plan, like a plot, or not a plot, like a scheme. And this would be mukhattat, masculine, Baghdad al-Kubra, feminine. Or خطة بغداد الكبرى, that would be the other option. خطة would mean a plot. And I was always feeling that if the word plot would maybe give a little bit more respect to the city, Baghdad, as a perhaps a conscious body that has contributed to the plotting around what was happening around it and to it. And I also like the sound of خطة بغداد الكبرى as all feminine words, But everyone else was like, and when I was consulting people, they were like, no, مخطط, it's مخطط. And this is when I thought there was this, but there was also when I was speaking to a poet, Iman Mersal, who wrote the fourth book of this a little bit moment of self-promotion. I co-founded with Mahama publishing a series of we co-founded a publishing initiative that's called Kaifata, and it's all how-to books. So our fourth writer, Iman Misal, is an Egyptian poet. She went in a solidarity visit to Iraq in 1993. And there she, with other feminists, they were blindfolded, took in a bus, searched, and then stuck there in front of Saddam Hussein. And he gave them a very very impressive liberal feminist speech. And they were like, what? They can't understand. Well, that was like that the other moment when I realized what my project was about. It's just to reproduce this history, basically in a feminine voice, if possible, even if it was utterly uttered by men at the beginning. And this is when this and all the other elements, also of course all these great women that I have already learned about in my research. I decided to just reproduce exactly the same work in the same number of works, and this was really a good decision because it saved my life somehow, not to make a 200 plate work, but there was let's just reproduce everything from the women's perspective. And there was this question, why still stick to Le Corbusier's gymnasium if we have figured out that it was fine, built and finalized? I did not want really to reproduce the same history without the woman relating to the building, because I did want to see if they related to it at all. So it's not like one way to escape it is basically to talk about something else. I just wanted to talk about the same thing and see if I can still do the same what I did in the first work. So the second version basically still attempts to have a more in-depth approach in looking how the building was built when it was built, how they decided to build it when they decided to build it, rather than they built it or not, And at the same time, understand, as I said, I forgot the idea, but it was mostly on who did what in these projects. Sorry, I remember.
Go ahead.
Like how these women appear also to the stories that appeared in the first edition.
But I was wondering if you compare the processes of research for the first half, which are all these male protagonists, and then the second half with it, did you have to dig deeper to find these, because again, one of the other ways men are very sneaky is they tend to write history, and they tend to write histories about themselves, right? So
it's partly
so
true.
how much, in terms of just finding the material, particularly at the second half with these female protagonists, how did it compare in terms of finding it?
Partly because of course, I reached out to more female architects, though I did speak also to a lot of male architects. Like I was saying, I'm focusing on this building, but I want to do this research on female architects, because of course I finished the work and many of these architects are not in it already, and it was embarrassing, but at the same time, so it's hard to explain anyways why I'm going on if I had already finished the work of that sort or that size. So I had to, of course, to speak to people again, but I also when I went back to read the materials that I read at the beginning, I mean, I had to, of course, or when I ran out of, because you don't also arrive to a place and you find all the materials there. You find a book, and then in the book, and then someone else mentions something, and then I don't know, you have a hunch, and then you pick up a book, and yes, on the first page says something. So that's how it was happening. But I also had to go back to the materials that I have already read for the first edition, and sometimes on the first page they were there. They were like, I was told to go and see the works of Ellen Jawdat. That's chapter 1, page 1 in the book. بس يعني I didn't see it. I saw it, but I didn't think it was something when I saw it the first time.
And then, perhaps the most famous Iraqi architect of both the 20th and 21st century was actually someone who was forced to leave Iraq and wasn't able to go back, and that's Zaha Hadid. And you'll see Zaha in there. Zaha came from quite an extraordinary family, and her mother was an artist, and her father was a very important political figure, co-founder of the Ahali Group, and then the National Democratic Party, and then became finance minister up till, as you say, the coup in 58. And full disclosure, I worked for Zaha over 20 years ago, and I didn't. She had two older brothers, and her father passed away, I think, 1999. But I remember, she didn't speak a huge amount about her childhood, other than to completely dismiss any assumption that because she was an Arab woman, that she somehow grew up in a fiercely patriarchal, misogynistic, sexist society that, out of which she was somehow an anomaly. It's quite the opposite. She always stressed the fact that she came from an extremely open and in her own way, for her gender was never made an issue, certainly within the family. You have the word feminist in the title. It's a huge topic, but feminism in the Arab world, and obviously it's highly differentiated depending where we will be talking about, whether it's in Egypt or Jordan but as part of your research, did you get into the histories of feminism during this period in Iraq? And could you say something about that?
Yes, but I did not want to go into this history like in the way it was written already in history, that they formed. So the people that I've studied really and read went again to read her biography, but also her poetry, was Nazik al-Malaika, who together with Badr Shakir Sayyab, they were both Iraqi poets who invented what is called the free verse Arabic, poetry. And normally it's attributed, maybe it's attributed more to Badr Shakir Sayyab, that he invented this sort of, or introduced this in Arabic, but many people also know that it was Nazik al-Malaika who started this. But it doesn't matter who started it. The fact that they both, people suspect who started it, was interesting enough, because she was of the earliest to go and do a PhD in the US, to live on her own, to dislike this, to form this league of non-marriage. I don't know, all of the women in the league have ended up marrying anyways. But she was also, it's I don't know how long this league went on for, but And then she also did. She was very famous. Her photos when she was a poet, so she was like really words, only words and things and ideas. And she was very famous. Her photos were put up in stores, in shops. So she was with her father in I don't know, if it was in Aleppo or somewhere in the north of Iraq. It was somewhere north. And she walked into a shop and she saw a photo of, she was walking the streets and people were recognizing her. And this was like, I think in the 50s or 40s. So it was that early on that a figure like her, she was very shy, not necessarily super beautiful. And yeah, she was more on the depression side than the really outgoing side. And people appreciated what she was doing because of what she was doing. So it was, I looked like also reading the biography of Balqis Sharara, who's like Jafat Jadirji's wife, who's one of the protagonists that both are in my project. She speaks a lot about how she joins the student movement, that is led by the feminists, and what did they did here, what they did do that, and all the footnotes in her book and her biography are basically of all these people. But I didn't want to take that as my entry point into this. What I wanted really was to look into the processes really and to how things happened. And who were the facilitators really behind, like, okay, someone who operates an office, but who works in the office, who makes the drawings, and in our case, in this case, many of them were women, and they had other projects in themselves. So for instance, architect Wajdan Maher, who was one of the four main architects in Iraq's consul Jadirji's office, she sorted out the papers with Balqis for him, to take these papers to him to author his seminal book when he was in prison for 14 months. But she also brought him cake to on his birthday, and which like all the other prisoners ate from. But she also issued these 4 issues of a magazine or of a specialized magazine on architecture. So there was so much already that she's doing, not necessarily under titles of or activism as a feminist, but really as someone who's really very good at what she does. And also very nice and loyal to, to her friends. And she was doing this. I didn't have to take a title or an activism title of any sort. And this is a proposal that I do. And the title of the work does not have feminist in it. It's femme, which like attempting to say it's a female version of a plan, the word plan. But it also might be feminist. I mean, these were some of the titles that I thought anyways of the work when I was thinking about it. And and in a way it works, so it's good to explore it this way and also to hear the feedback from others on this. But I did not take the typical feminist, though I tried to study it as well to see if there's anything there I could make use of.
I think it would be a really great time to walk over and get to know some more of these characters in detail. So for now, will you please join me in thanking Ala Younis, and we'll walk over to the
Thank you very much.